Hello, I'm Rudyard Griffiths, the host and moderator of the Munk Dialogues. Terrific to have you here for our fourth weekly conversation. 10 dialogues in all this autumn throughout September, October into November, exploring the big themes that are changing our world right now, from the pandemic to an uncertain global economy to a historic U.S. election scheduled just for a matter of weeks. What are the purposes of these dialogues? Well, it's not just the content, it's the tone, the style of these conversations that we're focusing on. We see each of these evenings as an opportunity to open our minds to different points of view, to different arguments, to different ways of looking at the world. You might not agree with everything our speaker has to say. That's perfectly okay. What we want to try to do in this highly charged, highly polarized moment in our culture is to reach across the proverbial aisle, to hear different views and perspectives, and to come to our own conclusions about the issues before us. Today, we're exceedingly fortunate to have one of America's most astute political observers as our guide to a dialogue on the U.S. election. His name is Newt Gingrich. He's the 50th Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's a congressman from Georgia serving 2 decades in the House of Representatives. He was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination and is the author and co-author of over 40 books, including his 2 most recent titles, Trump and the American Future, out right now. You can get a copy of that from our partner, indigo.ca, and Trump versus China, his 2019 bestseller. Newt Gingrich joins us now. Newt, terrific to have you here for a Munk Dialogue.
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I was going to say, I'm not sure how astute anybody is in the complexities of what we're currently living through, but I'm delighted. I've always enjoyed the Munk debates, found them to be very stimulating, found the audience to be, frankly, very smart. So when we had this chance, I thought it'd be a great time to explore some ideas and see where it takes us.
Excellent. Yes, indeed. We enjoyed your debates here in Toronto, Canada on our main stage, and now the opportunity to have this 1-hour dialogue with you on this storied moment on American politics. And Newt, I want to pull back and kind of engage with you as to what you were at the beginning of your professional career, which was a professor of geography of American history. So let's start there and have you reflect with 40 plus years of thinking and writing about American identity, culture, politics, and history. What moment in America's past do you think is the analogy that we could try to look to understand where America is today heading into this historic election?
Oh, I think there are 2 or 3 analogous periods. I think Andrew Jackson's rebellion against the Eastern establishment, which was a very contentious fight which changed American politics permanently. The Civil War period, I would say that in our own time, the tension, from 1967, when there were about 170 cities burning, through 1972, the revolutionaries set off 2,500 bombs in the United States, killed a number of people. The Black Panthers led a campaign in which they openly said their goal was to kill policemen. And it was only through very disciplined and determined policing that whole effort collapsed. But it was a very serious, very real effort in the late 1960s. This is, I think, more compelling, partly because it's the grandchildren of the people who were active back in the early and mid-60s, and they're more sophisticated, more numerous. They've got vastly more support in terms of corporations and foundations, so the flow of money is dramatically bigger than it would have been in the late 60s. And I think it's a genuine contest about what kind of country will be coming out the other side of this. So I think this is a story that you really don't quite know yet what the ending looks like.
So very interesting. Some historical parallels here. The period of Jackson, President Jackson, his kind of populist politics, and then, flashing forward possibly to the Civil War to 1968. Newt, when you look at those periods, are you, are you optimistic, compared to the challenge that America confronted in the past and the ability to overcome those challenges? Do you think today's kind of crises of politics and culture is somehow greater than those kind of moments of the testing of the national character of the United States?
Well, I'm very optimistic that eventually a free people will work this out. And I think there's still enormous resilience in the American culture and the American system. On the other hand, we have not had a competitor comparable to the Chinese communist dictatorship, which is much more formidable than the Soviet Union. And so as we go through a period of internal conflict that absorbs our energy, absorbs our personal bitterness, as you see, for example, between Speaker Pelosi and President Trump, we're doing that in a world where we have a competitor that's very serious, very focused, and I think very dangerous. And that makes this a greater challenge, I think, to work our way through this while still staying strong enough and focused enough that we don't ultimately succumb to domination by the Chinese.
Bitterness is an interesting word, I think an apt one to kind of capture the political flavor of this moment. Where do you see that bitterness emerging from? What are its sources? Do you see it as kind of structural, as related to something inherent to the political system, the culture? Do you see it the result of externalities like social media, like, for instance, the perceived threat of China, which is possibly creating a feeling of pressure or a feeling of competition that America hadn't felt for the last number of decades?
Well, I think there were two interestingly different parallels that historians will go back someday and take apart and write books about. One is that the classic white lower middle class, which is sort of the heart of our patriotism, the people who are proudest of the flag, proudest of the national anthem, they felt deeply put upon, particularly by the Obama administration, and the rise of left-wing professors and left-wing reporters and left-wing Hollywood entertainers. So they felt they were under siege. And their response started with the Tea Party rebellion in 2010, and the Democrats lost more seats in that election in the House than they did when I took over in 1994. We picked up 53 seats. They picked up 63, the Republicans, in 2010. So on the one hand, you had sort of a lower middle class patriotic populism in rebellion against the establishment. On the other hand, I think when Trump won in 16, it was a psychological trauma for the establishment comparable to an IED going off. And I think they've been suffering from the equivalent of PTSD ever since. And every time they start to calm down, Trump will tweet again, it'll drive them crazy. And so they've been in a state of rage for about 4 solid years. And so you have each side thinks it has a grievance, and each side feels it very deeply and is very determined ultimately to win and ensure that its version of reality becomes the future of America.
Is this election going to be cathartic to that extent, that you have two clear competing visions, two camps that have, as you say, very different cultures and orientations and outlooks? Or does this election simply compound those differences, potentially raise the grievances to even a higher pitch, a higher level?
I don't think we know yet. If you get a decisive victory by either Trump or Biden, you might have the beginnings of thinking through where we go from here. If you have a really narrow victory by either one, then the losing side will go into a bunker and start preparing for the next round. And I think we don't know which is going to happen. If Trump wins re-election, despite everything that the elite media has done to him for 5 years. At that point, he will be extraordinarily formidable. And if in the process the Republicans keep retaining the Senate, I suspect that the left will feel that it is mortally threatened. On the other hand, if Biden wins and in that process picks up the House and Senate, I suspect that the conservative wing of America will be terrified that they will try to turn the whole country into California and create a one-party system in which there's no effective competition. So I think both sides are a long way from being exhausted enough for this struggle to end.
Fascinating stuff. When you look at the contract with America, which was one of surely one of the big legislative accomplishments of the post-war period in America. You were its author, its originator, and you look back at the kind of values that you instilled, the policies and principles in that document. How do you feel about American governance and policy today? It seems in many ways, Newt, to have strayed in some fundamental aspects from some of the core tenets of that contract with America that was so politically successful in its time.
Yeah, look, first of all, I think it's very hard to sustain a coherent reform movement. We stood on Ronald Reagan's shoulders. I campaigned with Reagan in the 70s. As a congressman, I worked with him in the 80s. If you go back and look at the contract with America, it's virtually all Reaganism. So we'd had a long period of developing those ideas. What we were unable to do was invent a second act. And I just admit that. I mean, we had balanced the federal budget for 4 straight years, reformed welfare, cut taxes. We'd had a pretty significant impact, but we had not changed the underlying culture of the party. I used to reflect that both Thatcher and Reagan had failed to change their parties. Reagan had defeated the Soviet Union. Thatcher had defeated the coal miners' union and the socialist left, but neither of them could fundamentally change the culture of their parties. And so you ended up with a Republican Party, which I think turned out to be incapable of being a reform party, which is why by 2016 or late 15, about 63% of Republicans did not like their Washington leadership, which is what created the vacuum that Donald Trump entered. At the same time, you had a serious effort under Obama, which you can dislike or like, but it was certainly a serious effort. And its major problem was it couldn't solve the problem. You couldn't get economic growth. The very things they were doing minimized the likelihood that they could build a coalition. And so they so alienated the country that they lost a disastrous election in 2010, only 2 years after being in office. And then they were permanently, I think, caught up in a tug of war. The result's been, in my judgment, we're at least 20 years behind in serious, profound reform, and it debilitates the entire system and is a grave threat to our capacity to compete and succeed in the world.
Well, and that's where I want to go with you next. Again, the purpose of the show is a dialogue, so we're going to get to our audience questions momentarily. But as you say, there are so many issues that require, American competitiveness economically, geopolitically, in the context of the rise of China, something I know you feel strongly about and the threat that represents. Yet it seems that America has turned inwards. It's turned inwards in terms of its culture, its sense of moral obligation to the spread of a democracy and the ideals of freedom abroad. I mean, it's hard, Newt, not to be kind of pessimistic about America's ability to challenge China when its own house is so divided.
I think that's right. I think you put your finger on a real problem. Now, historically, democracies are very turbulent, chaotic systems. So, the great virtue of a dictatorship is that it looks efficient until it collapses. The great challenge of a true democracy or free society is that it's permanently chaotic, generates new entrepreneurs, new energy, has old companies die, new companies emerge. So there's a random chaoticness which would drive Xi Jinping crazy if he ever tried to govern in this kind of environment. The question is whether this the turmoil itself becomes a fertile ground in which we gradually rediscover ourselves, or whether, in fact, this inhibits us to such a degree that we no longer are competitive. And I think there are profound reasons to be worried that the Chinese have a model which I detest, but which is very powerful. They basically offer you stability and food in return for subservience and the toleration of dictatorship. And there's pretty good evidence that that's a model a fair number of people will accept. So I think that we do face real questions about our capacity to get our act together and to be genuinely competitive. And part of the reason I stay active is I'm not at all convinced right now that we're going to succeed. And so I try to do what I can through writing and speaking and what have you to get people to think seriously and deeply about how big the reforms have to be if we're truly going to compete with China.
Well, before we go to audience questions, I think it'd be interesting for our audience listening now to hear your case for why you think the re-election of Donald Trump stands America in the best chance of moving forward, I presume, on these big reforms that you think are essential for American prosperity at home, but also this challenge, this possibly existential challenge that China represents. What's your case? Because I think some people, Canadian viewers, would think somehow it's counterintuitive. You seem to be somebody who's very sensible, very grounded in the real politic of the moment, yet you're also a strong supporter of a president who is perceived to have divided, who is perceived to have distracted Americans from their international objectives and policies of the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's very accurate. In fact, I think one of the reasons you have never Trumpers is you have a whole generation of national security people who Trump has repudiated. And so they're understandably bitter because he's in essence made their life's work irrelevant. But it's not an unsophisticated approach. For example, Trump, the very first trip Trump took overseas was to Riyadh, where the King of Saudi Arabia, who detested Obama, thought he was weak and thought that he would not protect the Arab world from Iran. And the king wouldn't go meet him at the airport when Obama visited. The king met Trump, but more importantly, the king had brought together 54 Muslim countries, the largest gathering of Muslim countries ever to meet with an American president. And Trump spent 3 full days meeting with them. Now, as a result of that, they reached an understanding. So when he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, which I co-authored the bill to do in 1995 and watched every president back down in the face of State Department pressure. When he did move the embassy, there was no great violence, there was no great reaction, and in most of the Arab countries, they couldn't care less. So he then, having proven he had the guts to do it, went back to those countries, and for the first time in a quarter century, he got 2 countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, to agree to have a relationship with Israel. Now, that strikes me as pretty effective international behavior, more effective than any president in the last quarter century. But of course, he'll get no credit for it. You look at NATO. Trump went to NATO and said something which, by the way, George W. Bush and Barack Obama had said, which is, you guys aren't doing your fair share. But both Bush and Obama said it quietly, softly, pleadingly. Trump went in and kicked over the table. He said to Merkel, how can you be the biggest economy in Europe and not protect yourself? And furthermore, have a new gas pipeline, so your dependence on the Russians is going to be so massive. Why do you want me to protect you if you don't want to protect yourself? Well, of course they didn't like that. They loved being pandered to by Obama because he told them to do whatever they wanted to do and they'd love him anyway. And that's not who Trump is. On the other hand, as the Secretary General of NATO has pointed out, they've increased NATO's spending by $400 billion because of Trump's intervention. So I think because he's different doesn't mean he's wrong, and it certainly doesn't mean he's an isolationist. He has a very sophisticated sense that his job is to be the American president, not the global president. So just a very big difference in views.
Absolutely. And, I think that is a fascinating case that you can look at Trump's foreign policy record, and in that you can see some real substantial successes that I agree with you that are often overlooked. But just before we go to questions, though, I think it'd be fascinating for viewers to hear the case for Trump as a domestic president, because I think the intuitive sense is that it has been a chaotic presidency. The tweets, the attacks, the disruption, and that has distracted America from, as you and others have rightly described, these very difficult, challenging debates and discussions, and ultimately policy that needs to emerge to create a reform agenda that can position America for economic and geopolitical competition in the 21st century.
Well, Trump managed to get past an enormous tax cut. He managed to implement the largest deregulation program in American history. He managed to move the courts towards a constitutional originalist model on a scale none of us would have thought possible. He has used the Department of Education to start moving against left-wing propaganda and to start moving towards more school choice so that there's competition in the education arena. I mean, you can go down a whole list of things. The fact is, if you're faced with the level of hostility in the New York Times and the Washington Post and NBC, et cetera, that he's faced with, you're not going to know what he's doing. So they join him in a cheerful chase of his tweets. And I think he's comfortable with that because underneath all the noise, he's gradually, steadily implementing things he believes in. And if he gets a second term, he'll keep doing that. I did a book one time whose subtitle was Pioneers of the Future and Prison Guards of the Past. And the text basically was that all the innovators risk being overwhelmed by the interest groups, the lobbyists, the bureaucracies, all the things that are the prison guards of the past. Trump is not a traditional conservative, but he's probably the most effective anti-left-wing president we've ever had, because he doesn't mind following what William James called was the only true American contribution to philosophy, and that's pragmatism. He tends to do what works. And I think if he gets 4 more years, he will continue to reform the country. But he's actually implemented vastly more reforms than any of the elite media want to cover.
We're going to go to questions just in a matter of moments. But before we do, I think it'd be interesting for the audience, Newt, just to have, not a prediction as to who's likely to win, unless you feel like sharing that, but more a sense of how to look at the next 2 weeks to understand what could happen. Because you've got so much experience from your time in Congress as Speaker. You've been kind of living and breathing American politics for decades now. I think it would be fascinating for us to get a sense of what are you watching to try to understand which way this vote will go November 3rd.
Well, most of the people who I trust and who tended to be accurate in 2016 think that Trump is on the verge of winning, and maybe on the verge of winning decisively, because they think that the elite polls are so totally wrong and are basically rigged as propaganda devices to demoralize the right. But they don't know how to ask people the right questions, and they don't know how to find the right people. So the people who were really accurate in 2016 all believe, I think every single one of them believes Trump will have a majority in the Electoral College. I think the biggest question, the thing I'm most involved in and fascinated by, it's the topic of a newsletter I'm writing today. And as a brief plug, I do both newsletters and podcasts that are free at Gingrich 360. But I think the Biden corruption, if it actually breaks through, will end the election and end it with a shocking margin, because the scale of the 87-page Senate report, which the elite media has tried to hide, the scale of the computer, which has now been found, the number of people starting to come out as witnesses. We've had at least 2 in the last 24 hours who are business partners of Hunter Biden who say that Joe Biden was directly involved. And these are eyewitnesses. If this breaks through, despite every effort of the Twitter and Facebook and the national media to hide it, then I think you'll see the Biden campaign just literally fall apart. I don't see any circumstance when Trump falls apart. I can imagine him losing narrowly, but his base is so solid, and they've endured so many years of being lied to that I think they just shrug it off, and nothing the New York Times or the Washington Post or NBC says affects Trump's base at all.
And just finally, if we do not see a conclusive result on election night, and by that I mean one or either of these candidates winning a set of states that really suggests that they have a lock on that electoral college, do you anticipate a difficult, contested election phase? And how concerned are you about how that is going to play out, both on the ground in terms of the respective supporters of these two parties, increasingly radicalized, but also, in Congress and in the courts? What's your prediction if we are in that contested post-election phase?
Look, first of all, the election is going to take at least a week to 10 days. The Supreme Court decision, which was, I think, insane, to extend the Pennsylvania ballots until I think it's 6 or 9 days after the election, guarantees that they'll be counting ballots in Pennsylvania probably for 2 weeks after the election. So you're almost, you're guaranteed 20 or 30 or 40 times more chaos than you had in 2000 with the hanging chads in Palm Beach. And I would not be at all surprised to see it take us until the middle of November to begin to know who won. Unless one of them wins by a big decisive margin.
Wow.
So, I think that it is going to be challenging. I think it has implications. Frankly, if Trump wins decisively, Antifa and Black Lives Matter and a whole range of other groups will go to the streets because they will repudiate the election outcome. If Biden wins, the right is not as likely to go to the street, but the level of opposition to him will go up very dramatically.
Wow. Well, we'll have to watch those outcomes. So I want to remind viewers, just as before we go to take the first audience question, that we will have our usual post-dialogue members-only Q&A with Janice Gross Stein, the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. She's going to come on the program and talk to us about the consequences of this U.S. election for Canada, from trade to our own foreign policy to the border. Janice Stein, one of Canada's most astute political and foreign policy observers. We've got her for our members. Please register for membership if you're not already. It's free at monkdebates.com/membership. You'll get an email link for the post Q&A dialogue with Janice Stein. And again, that is free to register as a member. We just want your email, join our community, and be part of that live Q&A. Newt, we're now going to take audience questions. They've come in hot and heavy over the last 48 hours for you. I think a testament to your interest amongst our audience and your views here. The first is from Celeste Powell. She's asking, do you believe that bipartisan leadership, including in the Republican-controlled Senate, is still possible? Are American political leaders capable of pursuing collaboration and compromise for the public good? What's your take on that, Newt? And I guess it goes to part of what we've been talking about, which is the kind of state and future of American political culture. Is that kind of bipartisan aspiration really something that was part of an elite kind of view of how American politics should work? And maybe in your view, it's a good thing that it's gone away. I'd be curious to your thoughts on that.
Look, I think that principled bipartisanship is a good thing. And certainly we could not have gotten welfare reform or Food and Drug Administration reform or Federal Communications Commission reform, any of those signed into law without Bill Clinton's signature. So you had to have bipartisan cooperation. I would say that if you look at the Senate, people like Lamar Alexander, who sadly is retiring, but who was extraordinarily effective at bipartisanship. If you watched the Senate hearings with Amy Coney Barrett, at the end of it, Dianne Feinstein, the Democrat, actually hugged Lindsey Graham and said it was one of the best run hearings she'd ever been to, for which, by the way, she's now being pressured into stepping down as the ranking member of the committee because her left was so angry about it. But she was perfectly happy being bipartisan. And I suspect since he's in a tough race back home, Lindsey was thrilled that she hugged him in public. So I think it all depends on the circumstance and the time. Pelosi certainly has followed a strategy of basically scorched earth hostility. I mean, look, I was Speaker of the House for 4 years while President Clinton came in and gave a State of the Union. It would never have occurred to me to tear up his speech. I mean, what she did was an act of such hostility and contempt that it's pretty hard to see how those two ever work together. So the president cleverly sent up Mnuchin, who is not in her line of fire, and she and Mnuchin have had hours and hours and hours of conversation. Probably helps that Mnuchin's basically a liberal Democrat, so he can get along with her easier, I think, than say Mark Meadows could, who's a conservative Republican. I think you'll find that Mitch McConnell, let me put in a brief pitch here. Mitch wrote a great book called The Long Game, which is a memoir of, he had polio as a child. The only thing he ever wanted to be was a U.S. Senator. It's a charming and remarkable book called The Long Game. McConnell's perfectly happy to be bipartisan. He just wants to get his way. And if being pleasant gets him his way, he'll be pleasant. If being unpleasant gets him his way, he'll be unpleasant. And he's perfectly happy for the other guy to win something because that's the nature of the Senate. But I think it's a challenge. Schumer, for example, who could end up in a primary in 2 years against AOC, really has to worry about his left, because if they think he's a sellout or they think he's gotten too old, he could lose to her in a New York State primary. So there are natural limitations caused by the nature of your coalitions that aren't personality driven. They're more driven by other kinds of realities.
Great insights. Let's go to our next question for you that's come in advance of our speaking with you. What do you believe will happen both in the short term and the long term in the stock markets in the event of a Trump loss? Markets really have had a remarkable 4 years under this president, Newt Gingrich. As you said, the tax cuts were a powerful injection of, some might characterize it greed, others would say stimulus into markets. But what's your concerns here? You would obviously have them vis-a-vis a Biden victory. And let's go broader than just stock markets and have you talk about the American economy in 2021.
Well, I think it depends on how suicidal you think Biden and Harris are. They've said a whole series of things to get elected, which they might or might not try to actually do. But if they were, for example, to come out and aggressively be opposed to fracking and aggressively be opposed to all fossil fuels, the impact both in direct economy and the impact in fuel prices would be very substantial. And that would then have an effect certainly on the value, not just of the fuel companies, but for example, the chemical industry, which really relies on inexpensive natural gas. If Biden actually pushed for the size of the tax increase that he is campaigning on, I think you'd find people taking money out of the market pretty rapidly. And you have to remember that back when we had very high nominal tax rates up to, I think when Reagan came in, it was 71%. Most rich people didn't pay it. They paid lawyers and accountants to avoid it. So their effective rate wasn't dramatically higher than it is now, but they had to pay more, and they were limited more in how they could put their money in order to maximize, protecting it from the tax collector. So I think it depends. I worry in general that, and I say this as the only Speaker of the House in our lifetime to have balanced the federal budget 4 straight years. I worry about the volume of liquidity in the system worldwide. I worry about how we're going to be, even with Trump, I would worry about how we're going to manage a transition towards a healthier and more natural economy and away from a Federal Reserve Bank driven massively, over leveraged and overinflated monetary system. So I do think it's prudent to be careful. But if the Fed is prepared to continue to pump cash in, don't get rid of your stock yet, because it'll go up for another 2 or 3 or 4 years. But sooner or later, as they try to draw back, they're going to find every time they try to draw back that it has a multiplier effect in the market that will make them very timid.
Yeah, we saw that in 2018 when the Fed funds rate rose to 3%. The market corrected substantially during that period. And Newt, I mean, how do conservatives like you just generally think about this extraordinary intervention that's happening during the pandemic? That you have not only government stepping in through large fiscal outlays, but you have central banks around the world, including your Federal Reserve, stepping in and doing things that I think were just unfathomable a decade ago. Buying corporate bonds, in a sense, involving themselves in the machinery of capitalism in a way that I just think kind of questions whether the system is capitalist in the true sense of the word anymore.
Well, I would draw a real distinction. I was very much in favor of the president and Congress passing very, very large stimulus bills. I'm talking to you from Rome, where my wife is the ambassador to the Vatican, and having watched the Italians, who had the earliest experience of any Western country with COVID-19, I knew that it would get bad enough. And I wrote several newsletters aimed right at the White House that said, whatever you're planning to spend, triple it, because I knew this was going to be a big problem. Now, I regard this as the biggest problem since World War II, and we ought to approach it as though we were fighting a war. So you spend whatever you have to spend in congressional money in order to get through this phase. And then once you're out of this phase, you start thinking through how you're going to recapture things and move back towards a balanced budget. But to try to get to a balanced budget in the middle of this scale pandemic, I think would be an enormous mistake. On the other hand, I am deeply concerned about the amount of power the Fed has acquired, and I think that the Congress ought to really be doing pretty aggressive oversight once the pandemic's over, because I do think you're exactly right. You could end up in a crony capitalism. I think you did, frankly, in the 2008 financial panic. I think people like Goldman Sachs did absurdly well because they were so deeply connected to the Bush administration. And I think that that's wrong. And I think we have to worry very much about the financial guys taking advantage of all the rest of us.
Great points. Let's go to another question. There were many. We're going to try to get to as much as we can with our remaining time with Speaker Newt Gingrich. This is from William. He's asking, you've argued that Donald Trump is a person who can best counter an anti-democratic China. Can you explain why Trump would leave the Trans-Pacific Trade Deal partnership that excluded China and go on to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, the EU, Japan, and South Korea, our so-called allies? So I guess to unpack that question for you, Speaker Gingrich, I mean, as Canadians often, we are somewhat shocked by a change in what we thought was one of the closest bilateral relationships in the world, and that we too have real concerns over China. We're certainly experiencing a lot of pressure from the Chinese government on a variety of fronts, yet it doesn't seem that America is the same ally that it was to us in the past. Is that a misreading of the current, geopolitical play that the Trump administration has been engaged in, or not?
Well, I think there are three different things in that question. First of all, the president also imposed tariffs on China. So in that sense, and I think he imposed bigger tariffs on China, and has indicated he's going to do even more. So in that sense, it wasn't like he didn't have the same attitude towards China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, was widely regarded as badly negotiated. And, one of the things which I don't expect anyone to be happy about, but it's a fact, if you are the largest economy in the world, and certainly in terms of imports and real goods and services, we're still an enormous market. You are disadvantaged in multilateral negotiations because all the other countries can collectively gang up on you whereas you have substantial advantage in bilateral negotiations because no other country has the weight to compete with you. And so I think there was a sense that we had not gotten a very good deal. And I think even Hillary Clinton was very dubious about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think the other thing was that Trump came into office, had said for 20 years that he thought that our trade negotiators were terrible, said it publicly during the campaign. And so I think he looks at every single trade deal on the planet as basically a bad deal for the United States, and he wants to push and shove and see if he can get better deals and create more jobs in America. He's not a free trader, and I think he is probably what you could call a fair trader. That he's not for isolationism, he's not for trying to cut the U.S. off from the rest of the planet, but he is deeply, passionately committed to the United States getting the best possible deal, and that's going to step on a lot of toes.
Okay, straight up answer from Speaker Newt Gingrich. Let's go to our next question coming in from Dennis. He says, what responsibility do you take as the architect of the contract with America for the perceived polarization of American politics today? Newt, I think what Dennis is getting there, and I'm sure you're used to this question, you've had it many times, is there's a perception that something changed in America's political culture at the time that you were leading the U.S. House of Representatives, and that that polarization that birthed the contract, that birthed a lot of the political success of the movement that you led, went on to manifest itself in the Tea Party, in the Trump Republican Party, and that you're the author of all this, the progenitor of all this. Do you accept that label? Do you embrace it? Is it a misreading of history? Give us your take.
Well, I think it goes back to Barry Goldwater in 62 to 64, then was picked up by Ronald Reagan. And then I guess it's fair to say I picked it up from Reagan, and Trump picked it up from me. And the difference is very simple. The old establishment, the Democrats who dominated, they dominated Georgetown social parties, they dominated the news media, they dominated the Congress, they dominated the appointed bureaucracies. They were perfectly happy to have Republicans who played at competing. And they gave them crumbs off the table, and they had a dance they did together. But the Republicans had no hope of winning, and the Democrats knew it. And the Democrats were perfectly happy to take care of their friends, the Republicans, who were harmless. Goldwater came along and basically took on the entire modern welfare establishment and said it was wrong. He lost disastrously, but he captured probably over half the Republican Party. Reagan came along and said, look, there's a profound, fundamental different direction, which I want to go in, which ultimately ended up defeating the Soviet Empire, among other things. And for 8 years, we were moving in a direction that people tend to forget often involved real hostility. I mean, Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker, at one point said Ronald Reagan had ice water in his veins. And so it wasn't always happy and pleasant. When I came along, I had the temerity, after 40 years of being in the wilderness, to think that it would be good to have a Republican majority. Well, the Democrats hated that. I mean, the first 2 weeks we were back in office in '95 as a majority, we had to keep telling the Democratic chairman that they were now ranking members, and therefore they had to sit in the ranking member chair. They couldn't sit in the chairman's chair. Well, none of them had ever sat in the ranking member's chair. And they knew they hadn't done anything wrong, so it must have been Gingrich. And their allies in Washington all decided it was Gingrich. Not that they'd been in power for 40 years, that they were worn out, that they had no new ideas. And I was very proud of the fact that we kept the House for 12 years, and then after a 4-year break, we took it back again in 2010. But if you're going to be an insurgency taking on a national establishment, if you're serious, it's going to lead to real tension, and the national establishment is going to condemn you because you're not playing your role. Your role is to be the patsy. You're supposed to roll over and get beaten, or you're allowed to win as long as you don't take it seriously, which is why you had, for example, very weak people being appointed to the Supreme Court by some Republican presidents, And you've had very strong people appointed by Reagan and appointed by Donald Trump. And I think that's an example of the difference.
Okay, some interesting analysis there. Thank you, Newt. Let's go to our next question. We're going to try to get to as many of these as we can before we say goodbye to the speaker at the top of the hour. From Peter Zuck, we're asking you, we rarely hear about federal deficits anymore. Over the last few years, the amount we collectively owe, I guess Peter is emailing from the United States, has grown astronomically with no end in sight. How is this likely to play out in the next 5 years plus? So, you're great at that, at kind of thinking through, trends today, trajectories into the future. I mean, do you see a big kind of debt reckoning out there? We were just talking about central banks. They seem to say, hey, look, we're here to buy whatever debt, the Treasury issues. We're going to keep rates low. Don't worry, governments. We've got your back. There is no debt crisis.
Well, I think in the short run, there's no debt crisis. We resemble the Great Britain of Pitt the Younger, which was capable of generating so much money that it could defeat Napoleon because he just couldn't compete with them financially. So they could afford to subsidize armies all across Europe, and they could afford to do things the French couldn't do. We're very similar to that. We have an enormous amount of wealth. We are innovating all the time. We are creating new things, such as rockets that can be reused. We're developing breakthroughs in healthcare that are going to affect the entire planet and produce huge amounts of wealth as a consequence. So in that sense, we could carry a fair amount. I think one of three things will happen. Somebody will come along, panic, and decide they have to raise taxes. And if you raise taxes enough, you'll just crush the economy. And actually, at that point, the deficit will get worse. Somebody will come along and decide that you could actually do what we did in the 90s and have a very methodical plan, take 7 to 10 years, and get to a balanced budget and begin to really shrink the debt as a percent of the economy. Or the Fed could decide just to inflate its way out. I mean, if you have enough inflation, you devalue the debt to such a degree that it disappears as a percent of your gross domestic product. And that historically has been used. I'm talking to you from Italy, which has used it over and over back when it's one of the reasons that the euro is such a problem for them. Because when they had the lira, every time they had a crisis, they just cheapened the lira and devalued it. Well, you can't do that with the euro. So they're now trapped in a monetary system that's probably incompatible with the Italian economy. So those are the three basic strategies. I personally prefer a very methodical, pro-growth, pro-reform, controlled spending. And we did that in the 90s, and it worked really very dramatically. It took us 4 years to balance the federal budget. Nobody thought it was possible. We didn't think it was possible. We thought it would take 7 years. It happened in 4.
Let's go to another question from our viewers. That's the purpose of these dialogues, to take our questions from Munk Dialogue participants. This is Joseph asking, what kind of society do you envisage for the United States a decade from now? Sociologically, demographically, economically, what role do you see the U.S. playing internationally in terms of global threats? So again, Newt, another challenge for you to use that big brain and kind of future cast for us, look forward. What does American society look like a generation from now, and what does America's footprint and role in the world, what shape does that take?
Well, I mean, barring a catastrophe, we'll be richer, we'll have a bigger economy, we'll be technologically more advanced. Through the chaos of the free enterprise system, we'll have a lot more people rising. I mean, folks don't look at the underlying details. The income level of Indian Americans, people came from India, is much higher than the average American. The income level of Nigerian Americans is much higher than the average American. Now, this is a country that in the middle of all of its turmoil generates huge opportunities for hardworking, courageous people who are willing to go out there and do things. So Bill Gates drops out of college and founds Microsoft. That's not abnormal in the American tradition. So we probably will be still an aggressively entrepreneurial society, despite the efforts of the left. I think you're going to have huge turmoil in the universities because their current model is not economically sustainable. and they don't know how to deal with it. I think you will have a country which probably will be much more powerful worldwide. I mean, if you look at the relative growth rate of Europe and the United States, you can see that we're gradually pulling away. And part of it is, despite everybody yelling about immigration, we accept more legal immigrants than any other country in the world. So we had over 1 million people a year from immigration that's legal. And in addition, the people who do come here have more children than they have in Europe or Japan or Korea. And so our net size compared to our competitors will be getting bigger. We'll be the third largest country in the world in population after India, which will be first, and then China. But we will be in both per capita income and in the effective use of our GDP, I think far and away the most powerful and the most capable.
Well, Canada shares that with you to the extent that we have the largest per capita rates of immigration in the world. I think it's part of what makes North America exciting if we look to our shared future together. Let's squeeze in one more question here, Newt. You've been exceedingly generous with your time. It's from Carl Youngman. He's asking, whatever happened to Simpson-Bowles' report on debts and deficits and the 6 main issues it recommended that needed to be addressed urgently? Just to remind viewers, Simpson-Bowles was that bipartisan committee that kind of was tasked, Newt, with a lot of what we've been talking about, which is kind of looking at America's long-term obligations around Social Security, healthcare, how these unfunded liabilities were going to be met, and the need to kind of understand that they're on the balance sheet there. And I guess in the middle of this pandemic, you're right, we're having to respond to a collapse in demand in the economy with massive fiscal transfers. But do you still think that there's a consensus out there to actually deal with these debts and deficit issues? Because right now it doesn't seem to be very popular on the right or on the left.
No, look, I think until you get done surviving the pandemic and it eventually goes away as the Spanish flu did, and until you can get back to business as usual, you're not going to be able to have a conversation about balancing the budget. It's not possible. And I think it would be a diversion from what you have to do. As you pointed out, what you have to do is keep the economy growing, minimize the number of small businesses that die because they're hard to replace and they're the base of all employment growth, and prepare for a very dynamic future. So if we come out of this and, for example, in the next term, whether it's Biden or Trump, if they were to follow a very aggressive infrastructure plan to really modernize and make our infrastructure competitive with China or Singapore or et cetera, those kind of things could lead to the kind of economic growth which would then make it possible to start looking at how to balance the budget. But to try to do that right now, I think, would be a big misallocation of intellectual energy and leadership.
Okay, great insights. Newt, we asked you before coming on the program to give your recommendations for 3 books that you thought could benefit people to turn to at this moment to try to understand this moment that we're all in. So let's go through these books in order, because these are titles that fascinate me. So your first recommendation is The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity by Douglas Murray. Why do you think that's an important book for people to wrap their minds around?
Murray is a British intellectual who's done just an amazing job of looking at the various activist cultures and trying to understand what's happening. And I think he's basically right. When you see these waves of hysteria, 2 years ago it would have been climate, and you'd have had a 17-year-old lecturing you on climate, not because she knew anything, but because she was pure of heart, and therefore the news media could love her, and we all knew that we were supposed to be worried about climate. Now we're supposed to be worried about COVID-19, and that's the current panic. I have no idea what next year's panic will be. But this whole notion that what you really have is comparable to the medieval process of having people who, for example, flagellanti, who went from town to town beating themselves because they knew they were bad. And it literally became a sort of a movement. And that's a very interesting book. It'll make you think every day. You'll find yourself, I have to stop occasionally because it's so dense with so many interesting ideas and so many insights I'd never dreamed of that I recommend it very highly. He has another book coming out this fall, I think, and he's one of my favorite contemporary intellectuals.
Excellent. Your next recommendation was a book by Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War. Why do you think that war is important for us to understand? What key does it unlock for us in terms of geopolitics, politics writ large?
Well, many people think Thucydides is the first modern historian. He was a general. He'd actually fought in the war. He then took a long time and wrote a history of this war, which basically destroyed Athens and destroyed the Greek capacity to survive on its own as a civilization. Buried throughout the book, again and again and again, there are moments of madness when a city-state will disintegrate and end up in a war between its elites and its commoners. And these are unbelievably vicious wars where people literally engaged in genocide and massacring each other. And I think it's a very grave danger as you watch the looting and the burning and the increased hostility in the American system, as you watch Lebanon, as you watch Syria, as you watch the teacher whose head was cut off this week in France. This danger of a society suddenly blowing up and devouring itself is very real. And Thucydides is the great original description of that danger.
Wow. An important book, a classic for all times. Your last recommendation is, well, one of my favorite writers, Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Tell us about Edmund Burke and why you think his critique of the French Revolution, penned at the time, is important for us to understand centuries later.
Well, it's a remarkable thing. The American Revolution was based upon a doctrine that we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and existed within a commonly accepted cultural framework. So it did not have a requirement to go out and destroy the culture. It was a political revolution. The French Revolution is a cultural revolution. For example, they changed the names of the months. They guillotine people routinely. Callista and I went 2 years ago to Picpus, which is the cemetery in downtown Paris, where some 1,300 aristocrats are buried who were guillotined, and there were also some 22 or 23 nuns who were killed, who went to the guillotine singing because they wouldn't give up being Christian. And when I watch the hard left in America, when I watch Antifa or Black Lives Matter or the college professors or this idiotic suggestion 2 days ago by Robert Reich that we need a reconciliation commission like South Africa, you're watching totalitarianism at work. And Burke is writing and explaining why a totalitarian regime that seeks radical change is inherently destructive of freedom and destructive of humanness. And it's contemporary. He's writing as a practical political document during the war between France and England. But it is a really good warning to us that the left and its more totalitarian version is an enormous threat. And that these people, we've actually had at least 2 or 3 cities now where these people have been walking around pushing a homemade guillotine thinking it's funny. Well, it's not funny. It's the beginning of a world that says, if you don't do what I want, I'll cut off your head. And that's very, very dangerous. And Burke explains why.
Well, thank you for those 3 terrific recommendations. I also want to remind viewers of Newt's 2 latest books, Trump and the American Future, Solving the Great Problems of Our Time. That's out this year. And last year, his 2019 book, an international bestseller, Trump versus China, Facing America's Greatest Threat. You can get all those books, including Newt's and his recommendations, along with the suggestions of our other dialogue participants, on our micro store at Canada's national bookseller, Indigo. So go on to indigo.ca, punch Munk into the search engine there, and you'll go to a page with all of these books curated for you. You can order online and have them delivered. So, Newt, I want to really thank you for this last hour that we've been able to spend together. You've captured the spirit of these dialogues, which is a reflection on the moment we're in, and a reflection that is civil, that is substantive, that engages with the big issues and debates of our time. You've brought your usual perspicacity and sober, calm thought. So thank you so much. We look forward to getting you back up to Canada here for another Munk debate before too long.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up our dialogue with Newt Gingrich tonight. I want to remind viewers that we have our after show coming up right now in 5 minutes with Janice Gross-Stein. She's the founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. She's going to be weighing in on the effects of this election in the United States on Canada, on the border, on our own international foreign policy and domestic priorities. So go to, if you're a Munk Debates member, go to your email, look for that link to join us. If you're not a member, you can register for membership right now. It's free. And we'll send you a link so you can join the dialogue kicking off at 9:05 Eastern tonight. That is www.monkdebates.com/membership. Finally, I'd just like to thank the great partners that have made these dialogues possible, the 4 to date and the many to come. The Peter and Melanie Munk Charitable Foundation, who's responsible for the Munk debates. Everything we do, it's thanks to the generosity and public spiritedness of the late Peter Munk and Melanie Munk and the Family Foundation. Thank you all. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsors, Onyx and Gluskin Chef. We also have a great group of supporting sponsors, Torrey's LLP, Bond Brand Loyalty, and Cassette Media. We're also taking these dialogues across North America and around the world on CPAC, GEM, Facebook, through our partners Indigo, through NPR and WBFO, our fantastic PBS radio station in Buffalo, and through our national media and digital partner, the Globe and Mail. So thank you to all those partners. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Munk Dialogues. We'll do this all again next week with James Carville. So remember that. We've got James Carville coming up next Wednesday, October 28th at 8 p.m. Less than a week out from the election. We'll have a Democratic view on where this campaign stands, what's at stake, how that fatal potential post-election phase could play out in terms of a contested result. All that and more with one of America's most experienced and engaging political commentators, James Carville. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. We'll see you again next week. Be well, be safe. Tune in to the Munk Dialogues. Thank you. Good night.